They pointed their fingers. She poisoned him for the money. They whispered about my husband, Richard. His own family turned my world to ash with that lie. But what they didn't count on was the one secret Richard did keep, and the devastating truth it held.
Before the whispers, before the world tilted on its axis, there was just life. Our life. Mine and Richard's. 35 years we'd shared in that little house on Elm Street in Willow Creek, the one with the slightly crooked porch swing, and the rose bushes Richard was so proud of. We weren't wealthy, not by any stretch, but we were rich in ways that mattered. Quiet evenings, the smell of his pipe tobacco mixed with the scent of old books, his hand finding mine as we watched. The news. We'd talked about seeing the Grand Canyon when he retired, maybe even taking a cruise to Alaska. Simple dreams, I suppose, but they were ours, woven into the comfortable fabric of our days. He was my rock, my quiet constant, and the thought of a future without him was a distant, unimaginable shadow. Then the shadow began to creep closer. Richard hadn't been himself for months, a slow fading that he waved away whenever I voiced my concern. He'd always been a private man, stoic, but this was different. There were more naps on the old sofa, less time spent puttering in his workshop, a new kind of weariness in his eyes that no amount of my fussing could erase. He'd visit Dr. Mitchell, come home with vague assurances, and retreat further into himself. I tried, oh how I tried, to coax out what was wrong, but he'd just pat my hand and say, "Don't you worry your pretty head, Susan." It was his way, I told myself, of protecting me. I wish now I'd pushed harder, broken through that wall he'd built. The day he didn't wake up, a piece of my own heart simply stopped beating. The silence in the house was deafening, a hollow ache where his presence used to be. The world became a blur of hushed voices, kind neighbors bringing casseroles I couldn't eat, the endless numbing details of arranging a farewell for the man who was my everything. I moved through it like a ghost, lost in a fog of grief so profound it felt like I was drowning. All I wanted was to curl up and disappear, to rewind time to when his laughter still filled our home. But there were things to be done, a life to be honored, even if mine felt like it had ended too. His sister Janet and her husband Gary arrived from out of state the day before the funeral. I hadn't seen them in years, not since Richard had a falling out with Janet over some family heirloom she felt entitled to. Their presence felt intrusive. Janet's eyes, small and sharp, seemed to take in everything, not with sympathy, but with a kind of cold assessment. Gary just hovered behind her, nodding at whatever she said. There was an air of forced solicitude about them, a performance of sorrow that didn't quite reach their eyes. I tried to be gracious, for Richard's sake, but a small knot of unease tightened in my chest whenever they were near. The funeral itself is a painful haze in my memory, filled with faces I barely registered and words that offered little comfort. Janet, however, made sure her presence was known. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her voice trembling as she spoke to old acquaintances of Richard, lamenting how he'd suffered so much towards the end. But it was the way she looked at me, the subtle, pitying glances she'd cast my way when she thought I wasn't watching, that sent a chill down my spine. During the reception at the church hall, I overheard her talking to Mrs. Henderson from the library. Her voice was low, conspiratorial. "It's just such a shock, you know," she'd said, her tone dripping with insinuation. "Richard was always so robust. And Susan, well, she seems to be holding up remarkably well, doesn't she?" That was just the beginning. Later, as people offered their condolences, scraps of her poison began to drift back to me. To one of Richard's old fishing buddies, she'd apparently wondered aloud if Richard had changed his will recently. To another, she'd commented on how difficult it must have been for me, caring for him, hinting at a burden I never felt. Each comment was a tiny, venomous dart, carefully aimed. She never said anything directly incriminating, not then. It was all suggestion, a carefully woven web of doubt. She was painting a picture, not of a grieving widow, but of someone else. Someone cold, perhaps, or even relieved. I was too numb with grief to fully process it at first. The implications were too monstrous, too alien to the life Richard and I had shared. I remember standing by his graveside, the scent of lilies heavy in the air, feeling a new kind of cold settle over me, one that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. It was the first icy touch of the storm Janet was brewing. The whispers had begun, and they were about me. The foundation of my world, already shattered by Richard's loss, was starting to crumble under the weight of something I couldn't yet name, but instinctively knew was deeply, terribly wrong. My quiet life in Willow Creek was over. I just didn't know the full extent of it yet. The days that followed Richard's funeral were like walking through a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The whispers Janet had so carefully planted began to take root, spreading through Willow Creek like an insidious weed. It started subtly, a turned head when I walked into the grocery store, conversations that abruptly stopped when I approached. Then, the rumors grew bolder, uglier. I heard it from Mrs. Gable, who'd always been a bit of a gossip but usually a harmless one. She told me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, that people were saying I'd grown tired of Richard, that I'd helped him along. The word poison wasn't uttered directly to my face, not yet, but it hung in the air, a vile accusation that choked me. Janet and Gary, I learned, had been busy, painting me as a cold, calculating woman who stood to gain from Richard's modest life insurance and the sale of our house. They spun a tale of a long-suffering husband and a wife eager for her freedom. The official knock on the door came a week later. 2 local police officers, young men I'd seen, grow up in town, stood on my porch, their faces carefully neutral. They said it was just routine questioning, a few things to clear up regarding Richard's passing, given certain concerns raised by family members. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sitting in my own living room, the one filled with so many happy memories, and being asked about Richard's final days, about his medications, about our finances, felt like a violation. Their questions were polite, almost apologetic, but the implication was clear. I was a suspect. I tried to answer calmly to explain Richard's secrecy about his health, but my words felt hollow, defensive, even to my own ears. They left without making any accusations, but the shadow of their visit lingered, a dark stain on everything. The friends I thought I could count on began to disappear. Phone calls went unreturned. Invitations dried up. Sandra Evans, who'd been my closest confidant for 20 years, started avoiding my calls after one strained, awkward conversation where she'd mumbled something about needing space. The most painful blow came from the library, my sanctuary. Mr. Henderson, his face etched with discomfort, asked to speak with me privately. He told me, his voice barely above a whisper, that given the unpleasant rumors, the library board felt it would be best if I took a temporary leave from my volunteer position. Just until things blow over, Susan, he'd said, not meeting my eyes. Blow over? This wasn't a summer storm. This was a blight consuming my life. I walked out of that library, a place I loved, feeling like a pariah, the sting of betrayal a fresh, open wound. Then came the attack on my security, the very means to survive. A letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize, informing me that Janet and Gary Walker were formally contesting Richard's will. They claimed he was not of sound mind when he'd made it years ago, leaving everything to me. They alleged undue influence. Suddenly, the small savings Richard and I had, the joint accounts we'd built together, were frozen, The money I needed. For bills, for food, for a lawyer to fight this monstrous lie, was inaccessible. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I was alone, grieving, and now I was being systematically stripped of everything: my reputation, my friends, and my ability to even defend myself. The final, devastating blow landed a few weeks after that. Another legal letter. The Walkers, as co-executors of the contested will, were petitioning for the sale of the house to settle the estate. My home. Richard's home. The place where every corner held a memory, every nook a whisper of our life together. I was being evicted, not by strangers, but by Richard's own sister, driven by a greed so naked it was almost unbelievable. I remember standing in the doorway of our bedroom, Richard's old sweater still draped over his reading chair, and a wave of such profound despair washed over me that my knees buckled. They were not just taking a house. They were trying to erase me, to erase us. I became a stranger in my own life, an outcast in the town that had been my home for over 3 decades. The woman known for her kindness, for her quiet contributions, was now that Miller woman, the one who might have killed her husband for his money. The weight of the injustice was a physical burden, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Sleep offered no escape, only a brief respite before I'd wake with a jolt, the accusations echoing in the pre-dawn silence. The humiliation was a constant companion, the loneliness an unyielding ache. How could this be happening? How could a lie, so baseless, so cruel, have such power to destroy? The kind, gentle life Richard and I had built had been reduced to whispers and suspicion, and I was left standing in the ruins, utterly alone. The little rental apartment on the edge of Willow Creek felt like a prison cell. It was sparsely furnished with cast-offs, a world away from the warmth and comfort of the home Richard and I had shared. Each day was a battle just to get out of bed, to face the crushing weight of what my life had become. The silence was the worst. In our old house, even when Richard was quiet, there was a sense of his presence, a comforting hum beneath the surface of our lives. Here, the silence was empty, echoing with the accusations that followed me everywhere. I avoided going out unless absolutely necessary, dreading the averted gazes, the sudden hush that would fall over a room when I entered. Willow Creek, once a place of belonging, now felt like a hostile landscape. My attempts to find legal help were met with a frustrating mix of exorbitant fees and thinly veiled skepticism. Lawyers would listen, their expressions carefully neutral, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. A grieving widow accused by her in-laws. It was a story they'd heard variations of before, and without concrete evidence to immediately refute the Walkers' claims, I was just another difficult, emotional case. The little money I had managed to scrape together was dwindling fast, and the prospect of a lengthy, expensive legal battle against Janet and Gary seemed insurmountable. Despair was a constant companion, whispering that there was no way out, that this was my new reality. In those dark months, I replayed every moment of Richard's final year, searching for something. A clue, an explanation, anything that could make sense of the nightmare I was living. Had I missed signs of his illness? Had I been too wrapped up in my own routines? A terrible, insidious guilt began to creep in, not because I believed the accusations, but because I felt I had somehow failed Richard, failed to protect him, even from himself. The Walkers' narrative, as vile as it was, preyed on that vulnerability, twisting my grief into a weapon against me. Their story, repeated often enough, began to feel like a perverse truth to the outside world, and sometimes, in my weakest moments, I almost wondered if there was some kernel of truth I was too blind to see. But then, small things would surface, tiny inconsistencies that pricked at the edges of my despair. Sorting through a box of old photographs I'd managed to salvage, I found one of Richard taken at a town picnic about 8 months before he passed. He was smiling, but there was a hollowness in his cheeks, a shadow in his eyes that I hadn't fully registered at the time. I remembered Janet visiting briefly around then, a rare occurrence. She'd later claimed to others how healthy and vibrant Richard had seemed, how his decline had been so sudden in those last few weeks. But the photograph told a different story. It showed a man already beginning to fade, a man carrying a seared burden he wasn't sharing. Another memory surfaced, unbidden, during one long, sleepless night. Richard had always been meticulous about his workshop in the garage. Tools were always in their place, projects neatly organized. But in his last few months, he'd become unusually private about a small, locked wooden box he kept on his workbench. I'd seen him tucking a small, leather-bound notebook into it a few times, and when I'd asked, he'd just smiled and said it was old man scribblings. It was out of character for him to be so secretive, even about something seemingly trivial. At the time, I'd dismissed it. Now, the memory of that locked box and the way he'd guard it felt significant. What secrets had he been keeping in those scribblings? And then there was Janet herself. During one of the tense, mediated meetings with our lawyers, a sterile, soulless room where all warmth had died, she'd made a particularly cutting remark. We were discussing the division of some minor personal effects, things of sentimental value to me but of no monetary worth. Janet, her face a mask of false sympathy, had said, "Well, Susan, we just want what Richard would have wanted for his real family." The emphasis on real family was like a slap. It wasn't just about money for her. It was about possession, about erasing me from Richard's life, even in death. Her venom felt too personal, too deeply rooted to be solely about an inheritance. It hinted at something more, a bitterness that went beyond simple greed. These were just fragments, fleeting thoughts, but they were enough to plant a tiny seed of defiance in the barren ground of my hopelessness. The official story, the one the walkers were peddling and the town seemed to have accepted, had cracks in it, however small. And for the first time in a long time, a flicker of something other than despair stirred within me, a desperate, gnawing need to find out what those cracks might reveal. The days bled into weeks, each one a little grayer than the last. I had almost resigned myself to this half-life, this existence defined by shame and loss. Then, one Tuesday morning, while listlessly flipping through the local Willow Creek Chronicle, a habit I couldn't quite break, a morbid curiosity to see how my town was faring without me, my eyes snagged on a small boxed advertisement. "Estate sale," it read, followed by the address of my old house on Elm Street. "Contents of the late Richard Miller home. All must go." It was signed, "The Walker Family, Executors." My breath caught in my throat. An estate sale. They were auctioning off our life, piece by piece, to strangers. The memories, the treasures, the mundane objects that had woven the tapestry of our 35 years together, all to be scattered to the winds. A wave of nausea washed over me, followed by a hot, prickling anger unlike anything I had felt before. It wasn't the wild, helpless rage of those initial weeks. This was colder, sharper. How dare they? How dare Janet and Gary take what was so intimately ours and parade it before the town like common plunder? For 2 days, I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to hide, to spare myself the agony of witnessing such a desecration. But another part, a newly awakened, steely core I didn't know I possessed, knew I had to go. I had to see it, to bear witness to this final, cruel act. Not as a victim, but as an observer, unseen if possible. The morning of the sale was overcast, matching the gloom in my heart. I parked my car a street away, pulling a scarf higher around my face, my old gardening hat pulled low. Walking towards Elm Street felt like approaching a gallows. My old neighbors, people I'd shared cups of sugar and condolences with, were milling about, their faces a mixture of curiosity and, I imagined, pity or judgment. I slipped through the gate, my heart pounding, and stood at the edge of the lawn, a ghost at my own wake. The front door, Richard's beloved red door, was propped, wide open, a gaping wound. Strangers drifted in and out, carrying pieces of my past, a lamp we'd bought on our honeymoon, the old rocking chair where I'd read to children who were now grown. Then I saw Janet. She was holding court near the porch, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered on her face as she haggled with a woman over a set of Richard's antique woodworking tools. She looked triumphant. As I watched, hidden behind a large lilac bush Richard had planted, I saw her direct a man towards the study. A few minutes later, he emerged carrying a box. My eyes focused on the contents, and a fresh stab of pain, sharper than any before, pierced through me. It was Richard's collection of first edition poetry books. Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth. He'd treasured them, handled them with such reverence. Janet was selling them, his soul bound in leather, for what looked like a pittance. The final unbearable moment came when Janet, beaming, handed the box of books to the buyer. As the man walked away, Janet turned to another woman, a local busybody whose name escaped me, and I heard her say, her voice clear and dismissive in the damp air, "Thank goodness we're finally getting all this old junk out of here. Richard had such a habit of hoarding things, you know. Old junk. His treasures, our shared history, reduced to junk." In that instant, something inside me snapped. The grief, the despair, the helplessness, it didn't disappear, but it was suddenly overshadowed by a cold, burning rage. It was a rage that clarified, that focused. This wasn't just about money for Janet. It was about annihilation, about wiping away every trace of the life Richard and I had built. And I, Susan Miller, would not let that happen. That single callous remark, "old junk," became the spark. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The woman who had hidden in the shadows of her grief was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone with nothing left to lose, and a burning resolve to unearth the truth, no matter the cost. The image of Janet callously dismissing Richard's cherished books as old junk replayed in my mind relentlessly, a bitter fuel to my newfound resolve. The numbness that had encased me for months began to recede, replaced by a singular driving purpose. I had to find something, anything, that could expose the walkers for the vultures they were. My mind, sharpened by anger and a desperate need for vindication, began to sift through memories, not just for pain, but for clues. And then, like a beacon in the fog, I remembered it. The small, locked wooden box Richard had kept in his workshop. The one he'd been so private about. The one with the old man's scribblings. Why had it seemed so important to him in those final months? Why the secrecy? At the time, I'd respected his privacy, attributing it to his quiet nature. Now, in the harsh light of Janet's greed, that secrecy took on a new potential meaning. What if those scribblings weren't just idle thoughts? What if they held something he hadn't wanted anyone, perhaps especially Janet, to see? The thought took root, a fragile tendril of hope in the desolate landscape of my mind. I had to find that box. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp at straws, but it was the only lead I had. The problem was, where was it? When I'd been forced out of our home, I'd only been allowed to take a few personal belongings, hastily packed into a handful of crates. Most of our possessions, the walkers had insisted, needed to remain for the estate inventory. I'd stored my few boxes in a dusty, cramped storage unit on the outskirts of town, a place I'd avoided revisiting because it was a stark reminder of all I had lost. Now, it felt like a potential treasure trove. With a surge of adrenaline I hadn't felt in years, I drove to the storage facility, the old key to the padlock feeling heavy and significant in my palm. The air inside the unit was stale and thick with the smell of forgotten things. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly, labeled in my own handwriting from a lifetime ago. Christmas decorations, old linens, Richard's college textbooks. It felt like excavating a tomb. My heart pounded with a mixture of dread and anticipation as I began to search, carefully opening each box, sifting through layers of memories. There were old photo albums that brought a fresh wave of tears, Richard's favorite fishing hat, a chipped mug we'd bought on a long-ago vacation. Each item was a pang, a reminder of the life that had been stolen, not just by death, but by malice. Hours passed. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, eerie shadows. Dust coated my clothes, and my back ached. But I couldn't stop. I was driven by a desperate urgency. What if the walkers had found it first? What if they'd already disposed of it, thinking it worthless? Or worse, recognizing its potential danger to their scheme? The thought spurred me on. I moved deeper into the unit, towards a stack of boxes I hadn't touched since the day they were delivered. Boxes containing items from Richard's workshop, things I hadn't had the heart to sort through at the time. And then, tucked away at the very bottom of a crate labeled Workshop Misc, beneath a tangle of old wires and a rusty set of wrenches, I saw it. A simple, unadorned wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with a small brass lock. My breath hitched. It was exactly as I remembered it. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the smooth, worn wood. It felt warm, almost alive. A tangible link to Richard, to the secrets he might have kept. Now, the only remaining hurdle was the key. Richard had a habit of keeping important keys on an old, tarnished silver keychain, one he'd carried for years. I'd kept that keychain, tucked away in my purse, one of the few personal mementos I'd clung to. With fumbling hands, I retrieved it, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There were several small keys on the ring. One by one, I tried them in the tiny brass lock. The first didn't fit. The second turned, but the lock didn't yield. Then the third. It slid in smoothly. I held my breath and turned. A soft metallic click echoed in the silence of the storage unit. The box was open. My hands were shaking so much I could barely lift the lid of the wooden box. The air in the storage unit suddenly felt thick, charged with an almost unbearable tension. What would I find? Would it be nothing more than old receipts and forgotten notes, my desperate hope once again crushed? Or would it hold the key to understanding, to fighting back? I hesitated for a moment, a wave of fear washing over me. Fear of disappointment, fear of what truths might lie within. Then, steeling myself, I slowly raised the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed tissue paper, was a single object. A worn, leather-bound journal, its cover softened with age and handling. It was a simple, unassuming book, the kind one might use for daily thoughts or sketches. There were no markings on the outside, no indication of its contents. My heart sank a little. This was it? Just an old diary? But as I reached for it, I noticed the faint indentation of Richard's handwriting on the first page, visible even before I opened it. This wasn't just any journal. This was his. This was where he'd poured his old man's scribblings. I carried the box and its precious contents back to my sterile little apartment, the journal clutched to my chest like a life raft. I made a cup of tea, my hands still unsteady, and sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table. The silence of the room pressed in on me. With a deep breath, I opened the journal to the first page. The date was almost a year before Richard passed. His familiar, slightly spidery handwriting filled the page, and as I began to read, The world around me dissolved. It was as if Richard himself was there, speaking to me from across the Great Divide. The initial entries were mundane, observations about the weather, notes on books he was reading. But then, a few weeks in, the tone began to shift. He wrote about a persistent pain in his side, a weariness that clung to him like a shroud. He mentioned a visit to Dr. Mitchell, then another, and another. He described tests, the anxious waiting for results. And then, an entry that made my blood run cold. The news from Mitchell today was not good. Not good at all. Pancreatic. Aggressive, he said. Not much time. My hand flew to my mouth, a choked sob escaping. Pancreatic cancer. Aggressive. He'd known. All those months he'd waved away my concerns. He'd been carrying this terrible secret, this death sentence, alone. Tears streamed down my face as I read on, page after agonizing page. He wrote about his decision to keep his illness a secret, especially from me. I can't bear to see the pain in Susan's eyes, one entry read. She's been through enough. I want her to remember me as I was, not as a shadow of myself. This is my burden to carry. The depth of his love, his desire to protect me even at such a cost, was a fresh stab to my already wounded heart. He detailed the progression of the disease, the increasing pain, the nights he spent unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, contemplating his mortality. He confessed his fear, not of death itself, but of becoming a burden, of losing his dignity. Then came the entries about Janet and Gary. His tone turned from sorrow to a weary anger. He recounted past grievances, instances of their greed, their sense of entitlement. Janet called today, one entry read. The usual thinly veiled inquiries about my health, about my affairs. She and Gary are like vultures circling. I fear what they might try to do after I'm gone, especially to Susan. They've always resented her, seen her as an outsider. He wrote of his concern for my future, his worry that they would try to take advantage of me, to manipulate the situation for their own gain. He'd seen their true natures long before I had. And then, the most devastating revelation of all. In his final weeks, as the pain became unbearable, Richard wrote about researching ways to end his suffering on his own terms. I will not let this disease ravage me to the bitter end, he wrote. I want to choose my exit, with dignity, when the time is right. I must ensure it looks natural, for Susan's sake. She must not bear any suspicion, any burden from my decision. He didn't explicitly state he had taken his own life, but the implication was clear. A desperate, loving act to spare himself further agony and to shield me from the ugliness of his illness and the prying eyes of the world. He hadn't been poisoned. He hadn't been neglected. He had made a choice, a terrible, heartbreaking choice, out of love and a desire for peace. The accusations, the whispers, Janet's cruel lies, they were all built on a foundation of utter falsehood, a complete misunderstanding, and a malicious twisting of a tragedy. The truth, in Richard's own hand, was more painful and more liberating than I could have ever imagined. I closed Richard's journal, the leather cool beneath my trembling fingertips. The small kitchen was silent, save for the ragged sound of my own breathing. For a long moment, I just sat there, the weight of his words pressing down on me, a strange mixture of profound sadness and an almost fierce clarity. He hadn't been murdered. He hadn't been neglected. He had made an impossible choice, a final act of control in a life that was slipping away from him, all while trying to protect me. The grief was immense, a fresh wave washing over me for the secret pain he had endured alone, but beneath the sorrow, a new emotion was stirring. A cold, hard anger directed squarely at Janet and Gary Walker. They had known, or if they hadn't known the exact nature of his illness, they had certainly seen his decline and chosen to twist it, to weave a narrative of malice and greed around my name for their own disgusting profit. Richard's own words, his fears about them, his disgust at their avarice echoed in my mind. Vultures circling, he'd called them. And he'd been right. They had preyed on his death, on my grief, building their castle of lies on the foundation of his suffering and my supposed culpability. The injustice of it burned through me, hotter and more intense than ever before. The diary was more than just Richard's final thoughts. It was a weapon. It was irrefutable proof of my innocence, a testament to his love, and a damning indictment of the Walker's character. My first instinct was to march straight to the police station, to thrust the journal into their hands and demand they rectify the terrible wrong that had been done. But then I hesitated. The police had been so quick to listen to Janet's whispers, so dismissive of me. Would they truly investigate now? Or would they see it as just another piece of a messy family dispute? I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk Richard's final words being buried in a file, his truth silenced once more. No. This deserved more. This deserved a reckoning. A public unveiling. The people of Willow Creek, the ones who had so easily believed the worst of me, who had shunned me and whispered behind my back, they needed to hear Richard's voice. Janet and Gary had conducted their smear campaign in the court of public opinion, and it was in that same court that I would deliver my verdict. The thought was terrifying. I was not a confrontational woman. I had always preferred the quiet corners of life. But Richard's memory, and my own stolen dignity, demanded more than quiet resignation. My mind raced, piecing together a plan. It had to be impactful, undeniable. And then I remembered the one-year memorial service. Janet had mentioned it during one of her performative calls of concern a few months back, a way for the family and community to remember dear Richard. At the time, the thought of attending, of facing those judgmental eyes, had filled me with dread. Now, it presented itself as the perfect stage. What better place to reveal Richard's truth than at an event orchestrated by his own duplicitous sister? An event designed to further cement her false narrative of a loving, grieving sibling. The irony was almost too perfect. A new sense of purpose thrummed through me. The first step was to protect Richard's words. I spent the next day at a copy shop in a neighboring town, carefully making notarized photocopies of the most crucial pages of the diary, the entries about his illness, his reasons for secrecy, his feelings about Janet and Gary, and his heartbreaking contemplation of his final choice. Each copy felt like a shield, a piece of armor I was forging. Holding those pages, Richard's truth made tangible, I felt a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now overlaid with a steely resolve. I would not let them win. I would not let Richard's sacrifice, his attempt to protect me, be in vain. I would give him the voice they had tried to silence, and in doing so, I would reclaim my own. The Willow Creek Community Hall, on the anniversary of Richard's passing, would be the place where the lies finally unraveled. The days leading up to the memorial service crawled by with an almost excruciating slowness, each hour stretching into an eternity. The copies of Richard's diary pages lay hidden beneath my mattress, a secret arsenal I checked on repeatedly, as if they might somehow vanish. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by vivid dreams of Richard, of Janet's smug face, of standing before a crowd, my voice trembling. The quiet resolve I'd felt after forming my plan was now constantly at war with a gnawing anxiety. What if I couldn't go through with it? What if my courage failed me at the crucial moment? The thought of facing all those people, of deliberately creating such a public scene, went against every instinct I had. But then I would picture Richard's face, recall his words, and the steel would return to my spine. I owed him this. I owed it to myself. A few days before the memorial, Janet called. Her voice, when I reluctantly answered, was cloyingly sweet, a saccharine coating over what I now knew to be pure venom. "Susan, dear," she began, "I was just calling to see how you were holding up. This anniversary must be so terribly difficult. For you." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I managed a few non-committal mumbles, my hand gripping the receiver so tightly my knuckles were white. Then her tone shifted subtly, a hint of steel beneath the velvet. "I do hope you're planning to attend the memorial. It would mean so much to Richard's memory, for us all to present a united front." There was a pause, then, "Of course, if you feel it would be too upsetting, too much of an ordeal for you, we would all understand. Perhaps it would be best for everyone if you stayed away, didn't cause a scene." Her words, meant to intimidate, to subtly warn me off, had the opposite effect. They were a confirmation. She was nervous. She didn't want me there. The thought that my mere presence might unsettle her, might threaten her carefully constructed facade, was a small, grim satisfaction. "I'll be there, Janet," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. "Richard was my husband. Of course I'll be there." I could almost hear the forced smile in her reply, the slight tightening of her voice. "Wonderful, dear. We'll look forward to seeing you then." Hanging up, I felt a surge of adrenaline. The first shot in this quiet war had been fired, and I hadn't backed down. The day before the memorial, I decided I needed more copies of the key diary pages, just in case. I didn't want to risk taking Richard's original journal to the community hall. I chose a different copy shop this time, one further away, trying to be as discreet as possible. As I stood by the machine, waiting for the pages to print, the bell above the shop door jingled. I glanced up and my blood ran cold. Gary Walker stood framed in the doorway, looking around with a bewildered expression, as if he'd taken a wrong turn. My heart leaped into my throat. He hadn't seen me yet. I was partially obscured by a large display of greeting cards. Panic seized me. The diary pages were right there, on the glass of the copier. If he saw them, if he recognized Richard's handwriting, my plan would be ruined before it even began. Thinking fast, I snatched a handful of colorful brochures for local tourist attractions from a nearby rack and scattered them over the diary pages on the copier, then quickly turned my back, pretending to be engrossed in a display of pens. I could hear his heavy footsteps approaching the counter. He asked the clerk for directions to a hardware store, his voice gruff and impatient. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a minute before he grunted his thanks and left. I waited until I heard the bell jingle again, signaling his departure, before I dared to breathe. My hands were shaking and my legs felt like jelly. It was a close call, a stark reminder of how easily everything could unravel, but it also solidified my resolve. There was no turning back now. Tomorrow, the truth, in Richard's own words, would finally be heard. The Willow Creek Community Hall was filled with a somber murmur when I arrived. I slipped into a seat at the back, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and polite grief. Heads turned as I entered, a ripple of whispers following my path. I kept my gaze fixed forward, clutching the envelope containing the copies of Richard's diary pages so tightly my knuckles were white. Janet and Gary were at the front, greeting people with practiced sorrow, Janet dabbing at her eyes with a black-edged handkerchief. She shot a sharp, assessing glance in my direction, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly before she turned back to her performance. The service began. The local pastor spoke of Richard's quiet kindness, his contributions to the town. A few old friends shared brief, heartfelt anecdotes. Then, Janet rose to speak. Her voice, thick with manufactured emotion, filled the hall. She spoke of her beloved brother, of his brave battle against a swift and unexplained illness, of the unbearable loss to their family. She painted a picture of a close, loving sibling relationship that I knew, from Richard's own words, was a complete fabrication. At one point, she even cast a sorrowful look in my direction, speaking of the heavy burden Richard's spouse must have endured. The hypocrisy was almost physically sickening. I could feel the eyes of the congregation on me, some pitying, some still laced with suspicion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pastor invited anyone else who wished to share a memory of Richard to come forward. This was it. My moment. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to stand, to walk down the aisle towards the small podium. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on me. I could feel Janet's gaze burning into my back. Reaching the podium, I took a deep, shaky breath. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and laid the copied pages on the lectern. "My name is Susan Miller," I began, my voice quiet but clear, amplified slightly by the microphone. "Richard was my husband for 35 years. He was the love of my life." I paused, letting the simple truth of those words hang in the air. Many of you knew Richard as a private man, and he was, especially when it came to his own suffering. I looked out at the sea of faces, meeting some of their gazes directly. There has been much speculation, much talk since Richard passed. Today, I'd like to share some of Richard's final thoughts, in his own words. I picked up the first page. This is from his journal, dated nearly a year before he died. My voice gained strength as I began to read. The news from Mitchell. "Today was not good. Pancreatic. Aggressive," he said. "Not much time." A gasp rippled through the hall. I saw Janet's head snap up, her eyes wide with shock. I continued, reading Richard's words about his decision to keep his illness a secret to spare me pain, his descriptions of his failing health, his private visits to the doctor. With each word, I felt a layer of the lies that had suffocated me begin to peel away. Then, I read the entries about Janet and Gary. Janet called today. The usual thinly veiled inquiries about my health, about my affairs. She and Gary are like vultures circling. I fear what they might try to do after I'm gone, especially to Susan. More murmurs, louder this time. I could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances. Janet was now deathly pale, her hand gripping Gary's arm. Gary looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. Finally, I read from one of his last entries, his voice, through mine, resonating with a heartbreaking dignity. "I will not let this disease ravage me to the bitter end. I want to choose my exit, with dignity, when the time is right. I must ensure it looks natural for Susan's sake. She must not bear any suspicion, any burden from my decision." I finished. Reading, my voice thick with emotion but unwavering. I looked directly at Janet. Richard was not poisoned. He was not neglected. He was a brave man who faced an unbearable illness with quiet courage, and who, in his final act, sought only peace for himself and protection for me. The silence in the hall was absolute, a stunned, heavy quiet. The truth, in Richard's own words, had finally been spoken. For a long moment after I finished speaking, the silence in the Willow Creek Community Hall was so profound you could have heard a pin drop. It stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then it was as if a dam had burst. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a low, rising murmur of disbelief, of shock, of dawning comprehension. I stood at the podium, Richard's words still echoing in the stillness, my legs trembling but my gaze steady. I had done it. I had spoken his truth. Janet was the first to break. Her face, which had gone from pale to a mottled, furious red, contorted into a mask of outrage. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, shrill and ugly in the suddenly charged atmosphere. She stumbled to her feet, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She's lying! That's not his writing! She forged it! She's trying to save herself!" Gary tried to pull her back down, his face a mask of terrified panic, muttering, "Janet, no, sit down, please." But she was beyond reason, her composure utterly shattered, her carefully constructed image of the grieving sister dissolving before everyone's eyes. Her outburst, however, seemed to have the opposite effect of what she intended. Instead of swaying the crowd, it only seemed to solidify their dawning realization. Her desperation was too raw, too shrill. People weren't looking at me with accusation anymore. They were looking at her. I saw understanding, and then shame, flicker across the faces of people who had once been my friends, people who had readily believed the worst. Mrs. Henderson from the library, who had asked me to take a leave, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine horror. Mr. Peterson, Richard's old fishing buddy to whom Janet had spun her early lies, was staring at Janet with an expression of utter disgust. I didn't engage with Janet's hysteria. I simply stood there, allowing Richard's words and her reaction to speak for themselves. The pastor, looking deeply uncomfortable, stepped forward. "Perhaps," he began, his voice strained, "perhaps this is a matter best discussed privately." But it was too late for private discussions. The truth was out, raw and undeniable, in the public square Janet herself had chosen. Several people began to whisper loudly amongst themselves, their words now carrying not suspicion of me, but condemnation of her. Did you hear that? His own words. How could she? Then something shifted. Old Man Hemlock, a notoriously taciturn farmer who rarely spoke more than 2 words at a time but was respected for his blunt honesty, rose slowly from his seat. He looked directly at Janet, then at me. "Always did think Richard was a straight shooter," he said, his voice raspy but carrying clearly in the suddenly quieter hall. "And that sounded like him. Sounds like you, Mrs." He nodded towards me. "Been through the ringer." It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall of condemnation, a voice of reason from an unexpected quarter. Slowly, others began to follow. Sandra Evans, my former best friend, who had avoided me for 2 long years, got up from her seat and walked towards me, her face streaked with tears. She didn't say anything at first, just reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Susan," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, Susan, I am so sorry." That small act, that one apology, felt like a balm on a wound that had been festering for far too long. The tide had turned. The whispers were no longer about me, the supposed Black Widow. They were about Janet and Gary Walker, the cruel manipulators, the architects of a devastating lie. Their carefully constructed world was crumbling around them, and all I had done was give Richard's truth a voice. Watching the carefully constructed facade of Janet and Gary Walker crumble under the weight of Richard's words, a profound sense of, not triumph exactly, but of immense quiet vindication washed over me. The crushing burden I had carried for 2 long years, the suffocating cloak of shame and suspicion, began to lift, replaced by a lightness I hadn't thought I'd ever feel again. The woman who had walked into that hall, terrified and trembling, was not the same woman who now stood at the podium. That Susan, the broken, grieving widow, had begun to recede, and in her place stood someone else, someone who had faced down her accusers, armed only with the truth, and had, in her own quiet way, won. Janet's denials grew more frantic, more desperate, but no one was listening to her anymore. Her credibility, like her composure, was in tatters. Gary just sat there, head in his hands, the picture of defeated guilt. Several prominent members of the community, People who had previously been cold or openly hostile towards me now approached the podium, their faces etched with remorse. Mayor Thompson, who had pointedly ignored me at the post office just weeks before, cleared his throat. "Susan," he said, his voice gruff with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. Shame, perhaps, or grudging respect. "On behalf of this town, we owe you an apology. We were wrong. We judged too quickly." More apologies followed, some whispered, some spoken aloud. Each one was a small pinprick of light in the darkness I had inhabited. It wasn't absolution. Not entirely. The scars of their betrayal, their willingness to believe the worst, would remain. But it was a start. It was an acknowledgement of the profound injustice I had suffered. I simply nodded, accepting their words with a quiet dignity I hadn't known I possessed. There was no desire for recrimination, no need to rub their faces in their error. Richard's words had done that far more effectively than any accusation I could have leveled. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with the revelations, Janet and Gary were left virtually alone, an island of shame in a sea of averted gazes and hushed, condemning whispers. Several people I didn't even know paused as they passed, me offering a quiet word of support, a sympathetic touch on the arm. It was overwhelming, this sudden shift from pariah to someone who had been wronged and whose truth had finally been heard. The power of that simple, unadorned truth was astonishing. It had cut through years of lies, of carefully constructed deceit, like a knife through butter. Walking out of the community hall and into the late afternoon sun felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel. The air seemed fresher, the colors brighter. The weight on my shoulders was perceptibly lighter. I was still grieving Richard, of course. That sorrow would always be a part of me. But it was a cleaner grief now, unburdened by the suffocating layers of false accusation and public shame. I had honored his memory in the truest way possible by ensuring his final words, his true feelings, were known. And in doing so, I had reclaimed not just my name, but my sense of self. The fight had been arduous, the cost immense, but standing there in the quiet aftermath of the storm, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of hope for the future, whatever it might hold. The woman who had been defined by a lie was finally free to define herself. The months that followed the memorial service were a period of quiet rebuilding. The town of Willow Creek, to its credit, seemed genuinely contrite. The whispers didn't disappear entirely, but their subject had irrevocably shifted. Now, they were about the audacity of Janet and Gary Walker, about the depth of their greed and cruelty. The Walkers themselves became social outcasts. Their attempts to maintain any semblance of normalcy were met with cold shoulders and thinly veiled contempt. I heard through the grapevine that they were facing legal troubles of their own, questions arising from their fraudulent claims in contesting Richard's will, now that the truth of his illness and his state of mind were known. Justice, it seemed, had a way of slowly but surely finding its course. With the help of Jennifer, Scott, the lawyer who had initially been skeptical but became a fierce advocate after the memorial, I was able to untangle the legal mess the Walkers had created. Richard's will was upheld. The house on Elm Street, my home, was rightfully mine again. But standing in its familiar rooms, I knew I couldn't stay. Too many ghosts lingered there, not just of Richard's love, but of the pain and betrayal I had endured within those walls. It was time for a new chapter, a fresh start. I sold the house, not out of bitterness, but with a sense of peace, a closing of a painful chapter. The money from the sale, combined with Richard's modest insurance, gave me a security I hadn't dared to hope for. I found a small cottage in a quiet town a few hours away, A place where no one knew my story, where I could simply be Susan Miller, a woman tending her garden, reading her books, living her life. Sandra Evans and I reconnected. Our friendship, deeper now, forged in the fires of shared experience and forgiveness. She'd visit, and we'd sit on my new porch, talking for hours, the easy camaraderie a welcome balm. Other apologies trickled in over time, letters and quiet phone calls from people in Willow Creek expressing their regret. I accepted them graciously. Forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about me, about releasing the last vestiges of bitterness that could poison my newfound peace. I still miss Richard every day. The ache of his absence will likely never fully fade. But now, when I think of him, it's with a warmth unclouded by the shadow of those terrible accusations. I can remember his smile, his quiet laugh, the strength of his hand in mine, without the accompanying sting of injustice. His journal sits on my nightstand, a treasured reminder not just of his love, but of the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. The scars are still there, of course, faint lines etched on my soul, a reminder of the darkness I walked through. But they no longer define me. They called me a monster, a killer. They tried to strip me of my dignity, my home, my very identity. But they underestimated the quiet strength of a woman with nothing left to lose, and the enduring power of a love that even death, and their cruelest lies, could not extinguish. I learned that truth, however deeply buried, has a way of finding the light. And in speaking Richard's truth, I found my own voice, my own strength, and finally, my own peace. My life now is smaller, perhaps, than the one I once envisioned, but it is mine, reclaimed and rebuilt, with a wisdom and a quiet joy I wouldn't trade for anything. That long journey from a devastating lie to a hard-won truth taught me so much about the shadows people carry and the unexpected light that can emerge even from the deepest despair. Perhaps you too have faced moments where the world seemed determined to misunderstand you, where a single story threatened to define everything. It's in those moments, I believe, that our true strength is forged. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories of resilience and truth. And perhaps, let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. We'd love to hear from you